If Annelot's recording is like completely fucked, then the whole episode's probably gone. Unless I can just like remember what she said and then like I do a crude impersonation of her afterwards.
Yeah, that would work.
Yeah,
that would work.
Yeah.
I would respect it.
Yeah. We're all about silencing women on this podcast, and this is a new way we're doing. Hang on, let me just set my screen up a bit the way I want it to. Oh God.
There is a German basketball player with the last name Thijs, who was on the Boston.
Really?
Yeah, he was on the Celtics, I'm from Boston, but he was traded. But he's still close in my heart, so I like you already.
You remind me of him.
Thijs is very tall too.
I'm not very tall, not at all.
He's extremely tall.
I believe you. Why would you lie about this? So we might leave some of this in because it's decent banter. I think the only thing that I wanted to kind of like get out of the way initially that I thought I'd ask you two about that might also be a good cold open is I heard recently that coalition talks in the Netherlands turned into like a super spreader event amongst all the party leaders.
Yes.
Yes. Can you explain what happened there?
Well, I mean, the cabinet, the leadership of our country, are really bad at following the rules they expect the rest of the population to follow.
Sick.
They don't really get tested. I think Prime Minister Mark Rutte recently said to a journalist who asked, like, "Oh, have you been tested?" He was like, "No, actually, I haven't been tested throughout this pandemic." They don't wear masks, and they're kind of like, "Yeah, we have no idea how this happened." I think the worst thing about this was, by the way, the absolute worst thing is that one of the government ministers took the test. It came out positive, and sort of like in the act that set off the recent crisis, she rushed out with her papers. It was photographed. It set off a scandal because of what was on the papers. But she got in the car with her driver, and only after getting in the car, she said, "By the way, I just tested positive for COVID." Just exposing her driver to this shit.
Oh, good.
As a side note, I love just any like zoom in photograph of the paper that someone's carrying, because just the wildest stuff is written on that, going in and out of government meetings. Like you could tell me anything is on like. Yeah, I mean, now it's Biden, but like, yeah, President Trump, his aides were seen walking into his office with a paper proposing to build, a golden statue of him, 100 feet tall. And I'd be like, oh, that's what it said on the paper. I believe it.
See, that would be funny. Like this one was, it's pretty terrible actually, because like in coalition talks, like to create a new government, apparently the topic of this one pesky member of parliament had come up, a thorn in the side of the previous government. And it had been said, like, we got to find a solution for this guy, because he's annoying us with all of his checking our power. So yeah, that was a fun moment in Dutch politics.
Oh, did it just have like a piece of paper saying the guy's name and then question marks around it? Like what was on? Was there something on this paper?
Well, it's that position elsewhere.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I look forward to his new job in Brussels. Probably that's what that's for. Hey, this is your weekly corner Späti. Obviously, it's me talking here, Kieran, and I'm also joined with Rob.
That's right, I'm also here.
And we're also joined by two wonderful Dutch podcasters who I'm going to get them to say the name of their podcast in a second because, Jesus Christ, I can't. I'm here with Thijs and Annelot. Say hi, guys.
Hi, thanks for having us.
No problem.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Your podcast is called, I know it's The Reasonable Center. That's the English name.
Yeah. Het Redelijke Midden.
Just try it.
No.
Be brave, Karen. You can do it.
Don't worry. There'll be plenty of chances for me to like say dumb Dutch shit later on. I'm going to do the really fun thing where like all your parties' names are anagrams, but I am not going to be saying any of the Dutch letters. I'm going to be saying them as English letters because I don't know. Now that I speak English, I'm really into the idea of everyone else speaking English, even though ancestrally I'm not meant to be into that. But so as anyone can probably guess, we're going to be talking about the Netherlands. What's up? Explain yourselves. Why are you like this? That's the general vibe of this episode. For people who haven't been paying attention, there has been an election recently, which I love. Second year of the pandemic elections, because I don't know about anyone else. Maybe it was different in the Netherlands, but I got like no stories about like they're holding an election during the pandemic. The insane bastards. Because I remember that happened with the Korean election. Everyone was like, how are they doing this? The crazy people. Why aren't they postponing this? But now that it's 2021, they're just like, yeah, the Dutch are having an election, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they briefly considered postponing, like if there was a really bad surge of COVID, but everybody hated the idea.
Oh, cool.
I mean, it also became impossible, I guess, when our current cabinet came into trouble because they racially discriminated a bunch of people of the social affairs office. So they were actually fired, which is a thing we can do in the Netherlands that I don't think you can do that everywhere, where like they'll still be seated and in power, but they're called like, how do you call that in English, Thijs? Demissionaire.
Decommissioned? That kind of sounds like decommissioned.
Sort of, yeah.
I guess. Yeah. So they kind of said like, yeah, we completely fucked up. You're right to fire us, and then stayed seated. Because they have to like continue until the elections, but that I think also gave a kind of urgency to the elections.
It's a kind of caretaker, but like they're like, oh, we're not going to do like any new policy or very controversial subjects, but we're just going to manage the place until the elections have taken place. And our months-long
are they
coalition.
Still paid?
Yeah.
That sounds like a
really
good gig, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, like for the people then, like that it was found out and that they admitted to it, that entire scandal, for a second gave some people some hope, I guess, because we were like, well, there's elections coming up, so we can punish them for this terrible thing that they did that is really, really horrible. Yeah. And then
they gained seats.
Was that surprising at all? I mean, we even mentioned it on the podcast because we covered back in 2019 when he actually was no longer the chancellor. Sebastian Kurz in Austria had to resign, and then something like a few months later regained a majority, like a stronger majority for his party. And so when this happened to Rutte, I think we talked amongst ourselves that, I mean, we've been through this once already, but what do people say in the Netherlands?
Fool me once. Shame on you.
Well, one of the things they say is like Rutte has this image as being made of Teflon, right? That there's this impenetrable material and everything just sort of, nothing sticks to him. So I think not too many people were truly surprised. I mean, that he was barely affected. In fact, won seats. I mean, maybe the winning of the seats was somewhat surprising and dispiriting, but really, truly the most vexing thing is that the two members of parliament who have fought hardest to uncover this scandal, a member of the Socialist Party, the SP, and a member of the Christian Democratic Party, the CDA, both of these parties lost seats in the election. So we have this huge national scandal. Two true heroes of members of parliament go work around the clock for months on end to uncover it. And their parties lose seats as a result. Even though, and this is the paradox, many people in the Netherlands are actually genuinely really mad about this scandal, right? So if you poll it, people are upset and say this is terrible. And yet, so this is one of the things that I'm still struggling to quite to simply explain. It's but maybe we can take a crack at it.
Well, thank you for your hard work. You can go home now.
Joke's on you, I am home.
Well, that's it's interesting because I was also, we might come back to this later, but I was looking into who are possible successors for Rutte, because like Rutte seems like, we'll get into this later, but he's gunning for like longest sitting leader of a country in the EU now that Merkel's resigning. And the problem with Merkel is she doesn't have a successor. Like the CDU in Germany is very much built around her. And it kind of seems that's what's happened to the VVD as well. But like, I was being told by a Dutch friend, a Dutch comrade, that like one of the people who was kind of like geared up to be the successor, I've forgotten his name. I feel like Dijk was in it.
Dijkhoff, yeah.
There we go, Dijkhoff. I read it as Dickoff originally, so I was like, funny. But Dickoff, yeah, he's like, he was punished for this scandal, and he's like no longer seen as a viable successor anymore. And everyone's like, why was he punished but not Rutte? And they're just like, it's Rutte. It's what happens.
Yeah. I don't know. I think didn't Dijkhoff actually just leave politics?
Most of the stuff that I know about Dijkhoff is that he's very insistent on wearing cool sneakers, and posts a lot of pictures of his shoes everywhere. Yeah. I also remember there was an interview a few years ago with a child that was going to be evicted from the Netherlands, even though he lived here for his entire life. And he said to Dijkhoff, like, why can't I, like, can I just stay? I'm Dutch, I live here. And Dijkhoff said something of like, well, that's just not possible because rules are rules and you're just going to be deported. And that was like a kind of terrible moment that I don't think caused his downfall. It's just like another thing that happens in the Netherlands.
I mean, that's Germany as well. Merkel did the exact same thing. And that was live on TV. Oh, God. Sorry. And the kid cried in front of her as she explained why, the rules, and you just have to go back to Afghanistan, a country you've never lived in.
Well, I think I remember this clip, like, and at least Merkel, I mean, the things she was saying were terrible, but she sort of like tried to make this half-assed effort at being, being empathetic. Whereas this kid, like 10-year-old kid with a reporter in tow, and the reporter kind of like, has the mic and confronts this politician, Klaas Dijkhoff, saying, so, and basically exasperated at some point says, but he has to go back. Isn't that terrible? And Dijkhoff just looks at the camera and says, yeah, so like, just, that's it. That's
so
it.
What?
So what? Like, he just doesn't give a shit.
Yeah, I mean, I still love, like, even when presented with the opportunity to, like, can you do some, like, spin? Like, the cameras are here. Like, can you even do this? Can you even just, like, lie? And they're just like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, and I was like, all right, fair enough. Well, I think this episode we're going to go through how the Netherlands ended up like this. We were basing this largely on a good article from the New Left Review sidecar that Rob very kindly found a phonetic pronunciation of this guy's name. So let me give it a whack. Mulrain Ouden Ampchen. How did I do?
That's pretty close. Yeah, you did pretty great. Yeah. I'm quite impressed.
Excellent. We actually have a fair amount of Dutch-speaking listeners, so they're probably just all like furious at their phones right now. But sure, yeah, let's go. And one of the things that like he kind of has this like 3-part discussion about like what happened to the Netherlands, why you like this, explain yourselves, and yeah, first things first, I guess, is the Dutch kind of embraced the third way of like left politics pretty early, and this kind of leads us into a discussion of the Netherlands' like traditional center left party, the PVDA, Party for the Workers. A fun title that is going to ring hollow the further we go into this description. So yeah, I guess this is, we're talking 1995 or so. I particularly enjoyed the like Wim Kok. Probably not how I pronounce his name.
It is.
Oh, yeah. Nice. We proclaimed the definitive farewell to socialist ideology at a party conference. So Yeah, that's pretty damning right there. That's
the shedding of the ideological feathers, as it became infamous.
Ideological feathers. That's a wonderful language you guys have over there. So this is 1995. This is 1 year after Tony Blair becomes leader of the Labour Party in the UK. 3 years after the election of Bill Clinton. But one thing that Moraine kind of makes the argument is that the PVDA, unlike those other two like examples of third way center left parties, stayed like relatively left wing in their rhetoric. So party conference is kind of behind closed doors. It's a little bit different to say, I don't know, election materials. Do you think that's a fair assessment of what was happening with the PVDA at the time?
I think that is a fair assessment. And when you talk about the PVDA being sort of like very quick to adjust to this new governing dogma of neoliberalism, I think there is two factors in particular that have made this made it so that the Netherlands sort of switches very, very quickly, or maybe two or three. Let me list them very quickly. One, we had the 1980s, where coming out of the 70s, like many Western countries, there were problems of stagflation. Economic growth was abysmal. Government finances were exploding, and people had a general sense, right? This is the Thatcherite era, that something had to be done. And this was overseen in the 1980s by then Prime Minister of the Christian Democrats, Ruud Lubbers. And during this time, Wim Kok, who became Prime Minister in the 1990s, was the most important union leader in the Netherlands. But the particular structure of the Netherlands, of Dutch politics, is very much oriented around seeking consensus, right? People call this the polder model, right? Okay, yeah. And because he had worked with successive governments in the 1980s and had sort of like internalized this Dutch elite culture of finding common ground and taking responsibility for government together, I think that sort of fosters a culture of managerialism, right? So that's the one factor. I think the second factor is that there was a deep desire on the part of the PvdA to really reach power, because it had been out of power since the 1970s, which was the last time they truly were the largest party and had the prime minister. So there was that motive as well. And then I would say probably the third factor that is of some importance. I have completely lost my train of thought, so I will reserve this for later.
Nice.
I like there's a kind of I feel like a metaphor or something with the polder is like how you Dutch build those like little bits of land, in such a watery country, and just like assuming that kind of just that is an analogy for the kind of decision making that can crumble long term under the weight of a rising right wing, is kind of like how the Netherlands will be underwater due to climate change. So like enjoy your polder, but it's not going to last that long.
No.
Well, yeah, that's something we've been discussing as well after the election results. Like 3 of the 4 hosts from in our podcast live abroad, and I think it was Thijs who said, "Well, in 60 years that country is gone, so that'll fix it."
Silver lining.
It's a silver lining of like, this is all temporal. Yeah.
Problem solved. Yeah.
Oh no, I'm looking forward to like the Dutch new population of like a transient people group of just like roaming the countryside, begging on the side of the road in like higher latitude countries like Switzerland, being like, I will start a design agency for money, or whatever happens in Amsterdam. That's my impression of Amsterdam, is just lots and lots of design agencies. I was very confused about what the real economy of the Netherlands is, because it mostly seems to be like design and web agencies. But anyway,
I think we have a lot of marketing people.
Oh, sick.
And that probably relates to Mark Rutte as well, and his popularity and smile, and we are a country that smiles a lot while doing terrible things.
Yeah. Sorry, I just as you were saying that, I was reminded of the fact that Royal Shell Company is a Dutch company.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Progressive.
Isn't that great?
One of the things that's kind of like reminded me of, and I guess the Dutch Greens are a little different because the Dutch Greens have like left just like baked into the title of the party, but this kind of like left-wing rhetoric but governing on the right seemed very reminiscent of like Greens in any other country once they got remotely close to power. This is very reminiscent of like Irish Greens and the German Greens. Yeah, I'm not sure how fair that is, but it was just jumped out to me when I was reading this.
Yeah, I think it also relates to that idea of polderen. I think there's a deep desire on the basically mainstream left to build bridges between like center-right parties and themselves, with the idea that if they just keep talking with them and stay close to power or even share power with them, that they'll be able to at least get some progressive policies through or get some things done. And what ultimately ends up happening is that whenever a left-wing party does join a center-right government, is that they cannot do what they promise and lose more votes in the next elections. And then, so that's like a pattern that I see repeating itself, where they also like then again keep shirking against those center-right parties still in the election cycles of like, we are like them, but green, and we are like them, but we think women are great. And in general, we also disagree with racism sometimes. And, you know, they like water themselves down to basically get a chance to be in power, but then people ultimately do go for like the real thing, right? So
there's a real sort of, you know, in my kinder moments, I am thinking that the Netherlands, politically, the Netherlands are a center-right country, right? The left, even at the height of its influence and power in the 1970s, never commanded an actual majority of the Dutch vote share, right? So the notion that the Netherlands is a very, very progressive country actually in the numbers is not borne out. And I think many of the left-wing parties have internalized this to some extent and understand that, you know, the best they can do is have a booster election, outperform their usual numbers, and enter a government coalition with the center-right, which usually includes either the Christian Democrats, CDA, or the conservatives, VVD. Rutte is the VVD, right? That is in my kinder moments. I think in my less kind moments, I'm thinking that there's also a genuine belief still on the Dutch left that neoliberalism is simply right. I'm thinking of Jeroen Dijsselbloem, for example, who is a true and tested ideologue, right? Who destroyed the economy of Greece because he genuinely believed it was the right thing to do. And so in those instances, I don't really think that the left is merely beholden to compromise with the right at every single turn. You know, get a little bit in the margins. You know, some nice things for the environment here, some subsidy for a nice thing there, but that there's genuinely a governmental attitude that is neoliberal in nature.
Well, and that's like, even when you do want progressive politics to happen, like they are often legitimized in a kind of neoliberal way of like, it's profitable to have more women working because, you know, like it's never about real leftist ideals. It's always about, is it commodifiable, marketable, profitable? Then we will get support for it.
It sounds very transactional. Annelot, your description of those parties that are like, yeah, what they said, but we're green too, reminds me of the game show. I think this analogy will still fit for a European audience. The game show The Price is Right, when someone bets a certain amount and then you just bet $1 more to just cover them. So like, you know, they're like, hey, if you like that, but this is slightly better, then why don't you should choose us.
Right. Well, I would even say like it's the opposite. Like you go a dollar down. You say like, if you like that, you can also vote for us, and we're a little less racist, and like, you know, like we're a little kinder and better for the environment. But we will still make things profitable.
I think this analogy came up when we were talking about like Catalonia in Spain recently, where like the center party or center right party, the Ciudadanos, spent the entire time getting into these like culture war stuff and taking on the exact same position as Vox, the like far right party in Spain. And then it turns out when the elections happened, when people are given the choice between Coke and Diet Coke, they pick Coke. Like, just, let me have my treats. I don't want to. Like, why would I vote for the lesser Vox when Vox is on the table? So it's interesting that, like, I would agree that, like, the center right or the Dice, you're like, in my darker moments statement of just like a good contingent of the left across the entire continent, across the entire world, hasn't realized that, like, neoliberalism is kind of dead or dying. I feel like the right wing has kind of moved on to something else entirely, but like they haven't realized that this has been tried a million times before, sometimes even within their own country, within their own political theater, that like, oh, you get into bed with the monster parties and they will devour you and they will not compromise. And you've just compromised on yourself and you push everything rightwards and it's fun. Let's not think about it anymore.
It's very depressing stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's the depressing thing about being Dutch right now, right? If you're Dutch and you are oriented on leftist politics, like we are in our podcast, then this is exactly what makes it super depressing, is that we see all of these things that are happening everywhere, happen in the Netherlands too, but with like a delay. So we're just slower, we just keep believing and building on things that some other countries, at least to a degree, have now said that's not right, or have seen the consequences of what then happens with like fascism and an extreme right takeover, in ways that we have not yet. But we're just like, we're stuck in time, it almost seems, and like unwilling to listen to voices from elsewhere telling us that we're not doing the right thing,
I have to disagree. I think the Dutch centre-left, I think the PVDA is willing to listen, because I found out about this great moment of the 2015 PVDA conference where, while they were talking about how Corbynism and the critiques of austerity have no foundation, they were listening to a foreign voice in non-stop winner of the UK political scene, Chaku Amana. So, like, yeah, I at a certain point, I feel like it's just like a bunch of, I don't know, either fools or grifters. It's hard to tell. It's functionally useless to make the distinction on our end of just like convincing each other.
Let me expand on this, because the then PvdA leader, Lodewijk Asscher, this wonder boy of Dutch politics, who has since left Dutch politics, said that he looked upon the Corbyn phenomenon with glee, right? With because he was so excited to see the Labour Party imploding, as he implied, under this Corbynism, which was clearly the wrong way to go. And mind you, before he ascended to the political leadership of the PvdA party, he was the director of the VRD Beckman Stichting, which is their sort of like scientific bureau, their ideological bureau. And during his stint there, he was like inviting, and I don't know if you remember these names because it's like a blast from the past, but he was inviting Philip Blond, who had published the book Red Tory, and Maurice Glassman with Blue Labour, right? Which was this sort of David Cameron inspired conservative turn in British politics, right? All about the big society and how the state should step back and have civil society take care of itself. That also happened under his leadership in the PvdA. So during this time, and this is like the 5 years before they enter a government coalition with the Conservatives, there is this ideological moment in the PvdA where they say, you know what? David Cameron is actually great, and Corbyn, we don't understand it at all. Why would you, why would you be on the left when you can be a neoliberal?
I love that there's this feedback loop between the UK and the Netherlands, which, like, of course there is. You guys are right beside each other, but like at the same time, it's one that, like, I feel like the UK just does not acknowledge exists. Because Because I like this, like, you know, Dutch politicos just being like, oh yeah, David Cameron, oh, Corbyn, he's stupid, I like David Cameron. And then, like, you just ask a, like, random Labour MP who, like, Ludovic Asher is, and they're just like, who? What? What are you talking about? Sorry, no thanks, I've already eaten. Yeah, pretty much. But it is interesting that you brought up, I'm not going to pronounce it correctly, Dijsselbloem, Jared Dijsselbloem, because he is like this huge figure that I think a lot of people on the left in Europe remember, but then are probably, like, I remember him from that, like, period of, you know, the early 2010s, 2008, 2011, but then, like, constantly coming, like, I forget that he's supposedly meant to represent, like, a center left position because of what he did.
Yeah. Do we want to go into Jeroen Dijsselbloem?
I think so, yeah. Because he's, like, particularly an enemy of Varoufakis a little bit, or Varoufakis considers him an enemy.
Yeah, because I think for Varoufakis, like all of the arrogance of neoliberal government sort of like boils down into the figure of Jeroen Dijsselbloem, who combines a unique blend of extreme moralism with extreme neoliberal positions. Right, I think he drew the ire of many European countries when he suggested that, you know, the reason that austerity needed to be force-fed to Italy and Greece was the reason that if you allow them a little bit of money, they would just spend it all on booze and women. Schnaps und Frauen, I think he said, right? And this is, you know, that I think is Dutch social democracy of that era, at least to a T, right? Mm-hmm. Having fully internalized the idea that you need to hurt people to incentivize them into reform, but also cover it over with a deeply moralistic attitude about how all of their life choices are wrong. I think that is, you know, that is Dutch social democracy of that era. It's truly, it's monstrous, and Varoufakis is very right to hate him.
I think the thing that, like, baffles me about the Netherlands, I think you might have listened to the last episode, very recent episode we did where we covered mainly Volt, because they are my nemesis.
They're also Thijs's nemesis.
Good, I hate them.
Let's join forces on this. But, like, the fact that, like, Lubach, this, like, Dutch equivalent to, like, John Oliver type figure, like, did a bit about, like, Italians not voting in austerity governments enough, even though, like, they did since 2011. They've done that. Mm-hmm. But, like, yeah, great comedy, man. This is a fun show. But, like, it's such a bizarrely ingrained position, I guess. Like, don't get me wrong, like, 1 out of every 2 Germans you ask will probably say the exact same thing about, like, Südlanders and whatnot, and the Germans, the Italians, and the Greeks, not the Germans, the Italians, the Spaniards, and the Greeks and whatnot. But, like, yeah, it's this I don't know, social austerity as well as, like, it's the same, just like, don't give that homeless person money, he's going to spend it on drugs kind of thing. It's very grotesque, and I don't understand how they can come away from this and think this is the moral position. Also, I just find it very funny, the idea of the Italian government just buying women and schnapps, just like as a state position.
That's right. Yeah,
that would rule.
It's the new Medicare for all position. It's just booze and women for everyone.
I mean, that would have made, like, the Euro crisis maybe slightly more bearable. For the average Italian.
The moralism is also interesting because I would imagine that a lot of people who see themselves as very morally upright think, I need to do this because no one else will, for the good of Europe or the Eurogroup or the finance or whatever it might be. But really it's like, no, that's how you get off. You just love feeling this sense of whether it's superiority or you're the only one fighting valiantly against something. And it's just like, I just wish they would admit that it's like, this is just for me. I like being a dick. I'm not saving Europe. I'm not, you know, making sure that our children can have a good future. this is how I get my kicks.
Well, this is what the right wing does, and that's why they get votes, because they're just saying the exact same thing as Dieselbaum is, but just being like, yeah, but it's because I hate Italians. And everyone's like, yes, cool.
Well, I think it's also like in a way related to Dutch history in terms of like colonialism and the stories we are taught in high school about what we call the Golden Century, which is basically the century where we had helped invent slavery. And that made us a lot of money. So we get taught about that as Golden Century. And I think there's this thing in the Netherlands, like we're this tiny country with a gigantic sense of self. We think we are extremely important, extremely smart. We have a lot to say. We have a lot of opinions that we share with anyone who is willing or unwilling. We will share them anyway. I think we're quite famous for that as well, like being very outspoken. And there's also this idea that we see the world as is, while other countries might be like seeing too many ideological things or political stuff, or like they get distracted by things. But we, the Netherlands, we see how to run a country, and that's not that different from a colonial empire in terms of like we see how to make a profit, where to do that, how to grow. We are very focused on growth and the idea of getting wealthier. And I think that also all relates to that idea of moralism and being the ones that see things as they are.
I love because it's this very arrogant position as well of just like it's the classic everyone else is crazy except for me defense.
Exactly,
Because it's also the same of just like even when you have like this kind of center left analysis of like the rise of the right wing, of just like, oh, look at all these like I don't know, La Lega or Donald Trump supporters being tricked. That'll never happen to me.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Like, and that's a thing we do a lot with the US, and especially like since Brexit, also with the UK, is that we point to these other countries and say like, what a mess. We got it all figured out, and they're a mess. Which
you've got it all figured out as the water reaches my ankles.
So can I briefly go on a little bit of it might seem like a tangent, but I promise it will get back to this point, right? Because we've been talking about the embrace of neoliberalism as a sort of like economic doctrine by the Dutch establishment, and been tracing that through the 80s and the 90s. But I think there's a separate element that connects to this intense moralism on the European stage by some of these social democratic politicians, or social democratic politicians in name, that actually roots in some of the traumas of the left in the early 2000s, right? So the early 2000s bring this popular, like this sort of like rejection of run-of-the-mill Dutch progressivism, right? The progressive or nominally progressive cabinets of the 90s get repudiated. You have Fortuyn gets murdered. It's a huge national trauma. Of course, you get Geert Wilders in 2006. And the whole of Dutch punditry goes through this convulsion of trying to make sense of it. And of course, you have, immediately your like scores and scores of pundits who focus on Islam and say, it's all multiculturalism and migrants and Muslims, and they're to blame, and we need to be strict and assimilate them and stop immigration and whatnot. But there's a separate segment on the left of people that say, well, this is not really the root cause, although hostility towards these groups is a symptom of something. And they begin to theorize. And one of the people who does this was the then ideologue for the Green Party, the GroenLinks Party, Dick Bels, who says, well, you get this. The problem really is that citizens have now become fully emancipated, right? At the end of history, we have the newly emancipated citizen, an emancipation of the citizen, right, who is an individual, who is free, who has a certain degree of income and wealth at his disposal, and who would like to just enjoy life, comes in two varieties, a good one and a bad one. And the good one is, that citizen is happy, is tolerant, is modest about him, the space that he takes himself, as generous, as open towards the world, etc. I would like to share the affluence that he enjoys. And then there's the bad one who's just greedy and egotistical and wants to drive a big vehicle with wants to play loud music and wants to take a lot of space for himself. But you see that the left adopts, in response to this cultural unease, a moralistic attitude about, how we are now stuck with a citizen that we don't really like. And so their solution to this problem is maybe the left needs to re-embrace a moral vision for society, right? What good citizenship means. And we need to stop being so permissive about everything. And out of this moment come politicians like Jeroen Dijsselbloem, who before wrecking Greece actually made a name for himself by leading a crusade against nudity on television and violence in video games. Yes. And Lodewijk Asscher, who before, stepping to the national stage of politics was a local alderman in Amsterdam and cracked down on the red light district. Again, out of this sense of, I'm saving these women who are all victims of trafficking and who shouldn't be doing these professions anyway, and really cleaning up Amsterdam because it's been too permissive. Of course, under the guise of this comes gentrification, etc. But this was the moral image that he projects. So there's a generation of leftist politicians that step onto the national stage just before 2010, just before they actually ascent to actual power, who are deeply, deeply, deeply moralist in their conception of what it means to be on the left, right? They need to save society from itself. And I think this is reflected to some extent in, them going to Greece and saying, you're doing this all wrong. Let me step in and tell you how it's supposed to be done.
Yeah, I think moralism is like, it always has to have, it's always relational, right? Like you can't prove that you are fighting like an upright citizen, developing upright society, unless there's an enemy, right? Or someone lazy or someone corrupting your society that you can take on, because, it's never there. We solved all the problems. We are a perfect, upright society. Like, it'll always just, I don't know, turn to a new enemy.
Someone sneezes and everyone turns around and looks at them with like Children of the Corn.
Yeah.
It's a very it's also deeply horrifyingly colonial mindset as well, because when you just like outline that, and it all seems very colonialism turned inward, as I think Rob has made this point, particularly about America, of just like the cops living in the suburbs and viewing the city as this place that needs to be tamed. Yeah. Because like what you're describing with the red light district in Amsterdam also seems very similar as well. And also, how can you be like a Dutch politician and not be aware of like where the tourism money comes from? Jesus Christ!
Well, but there was literally an argument at the time on the left being like, "Oh, this is bad tourism. We need better tourism. Like we need people." No, literally, we need we need people spending money in the museum gift shop instead of at the red light district.
That's I'm sorry. Like any Dutch politician that's thinking that they're going to have like a tourist economy not based on drunk English people falling into canals is just like a fool. A fool.
Just the idea that any left ideology can be pro-tourism is a very fun idea to me. I mean, like, we all know what tourism like does to an economy, right? It's very much like all-encompassing, especially for countries that don't have, their marketing and other industries to fall back on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like, the tourism trap. Like, yeah. Look at like again the southern economies during the pandemic when no one can fly to them during the summer months. Greece is like, did like Greece doctor their corona numbers to like so they could justify people coming in the summer, last summer now. I wish Nick was here; he would have known that. But yeah. Before we leave the discussions of PVDA to move on to more horrifying pastures, I guess, we should probably talk about 2017, because my understanding is 2017 is this like watershed moment of maybe not everyone, maybe not the right people realizing that the jig is up, but the jig is up. The PVDA kind of loses a bunch of seats. And their old strategy doesn't seem to be working anymore. What exactly happened in 2017?
Electorally to the PvdA.
I mean, I guess just like what were voters thinking? Why? Well, yeah. Let's start with what happened electorally to them, I guess.
So, I mean, two parties got rewarded for a very successful right-wing government, and that was the right-wing party and the nominally left-wing party, and they got rewarded according to their contribution. That is to say, the right-wing party won seats because they had done spectacularly well doing right-wing policy, and the left-wing party, the PvdA, got hammered because they did spectacularly well pursuing right-wing policy. And because they had been in the governing coalition with Rutte's VVD. I guess, that's kind of where they were at, right? They got their just desserts in a way.
Well, and then if you ask what were people thinking, like that moment in Dutch culture was a very strange moment, because on the one hand, we were watching the US and the UK basically fall apart and going terribly wrong. And at the same time, we had in the Netherlands as well a lot of discussion around, for example, Me Too, but also a lot of more media attention for Zwarte Piet, or racist blackface thing. And we had a lot of people speaking out to that being racist and protesting it. And these protesters were then attacked, and the police didn't handle it well. And so there were this paradox of the Dutch culture was going on, where the people on the one hand were saying like, oh, we're not like the Americans or the Brits. We are reasonable people and we see things as they are, and we don't get into that sort of drama. But then at the same time, these people like that were fighting for gender rights, for gender equality, against sexual violence, against racism, these anti-racist activists were all kind of painted out to be disturbing the peace. Right. And like we're at the same time seen as like, you're trying to make this into a mess, and these are American things that you're trying to import to this country because we are the Netherlands and we don't have that kind of issues. We don't have those kind of issues because we're very progressive and we're very liberal. So you had that like great paradox of Dutch culture again, where basically all the voices from the margins who were saying like, no, things are not going well, were silenced with like, can't you see how the rest of the world is falling apart while we are doing great? We are great and liberal and progressive.
Yeah, it's very reminiscent. It's something that comes up a lot when any discussions of like race happens, pretty much in any continental European country, to a lesser extent also the UK, where they're just like, no, this is American stuff. We never had these problems. We never did slavery. We never did a bunch of stuff that we totally did do. So yeah, that's very fair. But I guess this kind of leads us into the second point pretty well, with discussions of Zwarte Piet, the term you're not allowed to ever type on Twitter unless you don't want like 20 Dutch reply guys coming in.
Yeah,
we did a whole episode on that. But we're talking about, I guess, the culture wars that kind of consumed 90s Netherlands and have kind of taken place ever since. One thing that I saw a journalist in Berlin, a Dutch journalist in Berlin, kind of point out that the Netherlands, while being the first at a lot of things like gay marriage and like a kind of a laxer policy to some of the lesser drugs, did also point out that they were the first country in Europe to have a prominent role for the far right. You've already mentioned Wilders, but he's kind of an OG. He's been there longer than your Salvinis, your AFDs in Germany. I think the only other country that kind of compares is Austria, where the FPÖ has been around since the Nazis were allowed to be a thing. Yeah. And this is,
there was this incredible moment in the most recent election where during, I think it was the final debate between the party leaders, broadcasted live on Dutch television, where Mark Rutte said, and so Mark Rutte had coasted to power in 2017, And this was very quickly explained also in many English language and international media as the good populism won over the bad populism, right? Mark Rutte triumphed over Geert Wilders by tacking somewhat to the right, but still being, presentable and Mark Rutte can be received in polite society. And the political scientist Cas Mudde recently pointed this out, that it's complete bogus, because actually the far right, again, this most recent election, expanded its vote share, right? The Dutch far right is far from being defeated. In fact, it has continued to grow under Rutte in spite of this line about the good populism, quote unquote, defeating the bad populism. But there was this really telling moment in that recent last debate where Mark Rutte said basically, well, Mr. Geert Wilders, you challenge me, but while you are just like angrily tweeting, I am preventing immigrants from getting here. Supposedly, intended as this kind of big own, being like, oh, well, you just tweeting about it, but I get shit done. And many people immediately were quick to point out on Twitter, being like, so, what's the difference then? Like he's tweeting and you act as his lapdog and get it done.
Yeah. The difference is, from a utilitarian point of view, he is more evil, and then he sits back and waits for applause.
Right. Yeah.
I am actually the bad guy.
So there is, in fact, this constant drift towards the far right. And even now, and this is, I think, a very interesting point. So there's all this talk right now because Mark Rutte is in some kind of political trouble because he lies too many times. And I see friends who I consider to be broadly on the left saying, well, it would be good if Mark Rutte goes because he's bad. But at the same time, what if someone worse comes back? So there is people on the left whose credentials I don't really question, who are kind of struck with fear that, of all the bad things that we have in the Netherlands, that Mark Rutte is still sort of like one of the people who is at least dependably
reasonable.
Like somewhat reliable, and that, the alternative to Rutte, whatever it is, from his own party or from the far right, is going to be an infinite number of times worse. So even people on the left are kind of like, Rutte isn't so bad, even though he's terrible.
I can slightly go back and relate all of this again to that 2017 moment that was very crucial, because I think that what Mark Rutte did in 2017 is exactly what Thijs said. Like, he was getting closer and closer to the extreme right. And one of the biggest things that he did was he had this big advertisement in a national newspaper that was a full page of basically a letter to Dutch people. And the entire letter was basically about, we, the Netherlands, we are very invested in being normal, acting normal, doing normal things, having normal opinions, normal behavior. So he wrote this letter that said, like, well, most of the people in this country are of goodwill, is what he wrote, because this is a great country, but there are some who are of bad will, have bad will and bad faith, and they are antisocial. And with them, he mostly pointed at anti-racist activism, but basically activists in general. And the letters literally said, be normal, like act normal, or go away, like go to wherever you think it's better, because you're being ungrateful and you're disturbing the country, you're being annoying. And you can't just yell when you don't like things, was something he wrote in it as well. So he really paved the way for a lot of more right-wing voters to like him, and kept doing that. And this entire notion of normality is, I think, a very smart way of speaking to the Dutch, because I think there are a lot of people in the Netherlands who dream of nothing more, who aspire to nothing more than being normal and acting normal and doing normal, which obviously means like this constant investment in the renewal of the status quo, for people who just want to a degree live an apolitical life. We talked about that very briefly at the beginning. I'm not sure we were taping yet, about that idea of just being left alone, and almost libertarian views of, I don't want politics in my life at all. I just want to be normal and lead a normal life, is, I think,
It sounds like a joke
a very Dutch dream
from 2017 Twitter. Dutch is just a normal world. Netherlands are normal worlds. They're very normal people. This is something I think just to, I feel like I keep making the same point, but I want to add something else I forgot, which is I've tried to make this point on the show before, but something about liberalism in particular is like, I feel like it's impossible for like the liberal subject to be like fully realized politically, because there's something about the basic tenets of like a liberal ideology, and I think this ties into the moralism idea, that there's always someone else who isn't the same as you, where there are always these like differences built in, because for you to be a moral person there has to be immoral people, because otherwise how do you know you're moral? And you can apply that to so many things, like that you are working harder, there have to be people who aren't working hard, and this and that, and it's impossible. And I think this manifests itself with when it comes to the right wing, because there's this imaginary of this like mass of people who are fundamentally different than you, because that's how you know you're better, but that will always be tempted by these dark forces that of course you aren't tempted by. Again, to prove how well you aren't tempted by the right wing, you have to show how much everyone else is. And it leads to like it creates like a fundamental impasse in liberal thinking, because and certainly to like any kind of mass politics, because at its fundamental core, you define yourself in such a way to other people that it's like you would be losing what makes you feel good, whatever you think you're better, in order to take that step into like a kind of mass politics with other people.
I mean, that's like perfectly exemplified in the like women and schnapps line of just like, oh, if Italians get half a chance, they'll spend all their money on women and schnapps. Two things Dutch people famously hate. We hate that over here. Was a very sexless, teetotaling country. Sexless, snapless. See, the Italians even drink schnapps. I feel like that is a very just like, don't sign your own tweets type of thing. Like, 'cause I feel like it's the Germanic peoples who drink schnapps. I don't know, but like,
Genever probably.
The Italians, they won't stop doing blackface, and they should just work hard. I don't know why they spend all day creating elaborate costumes.
Well, that was that magazine cover we got obsessed with. There was a Dutch right-wing magazine cover. This was around the time when the Eurobonds were being discussed. We refer to it as the Italian Stalin magazine, because it was on the top of the magazine cover like hard-working Dutch people, and then on the bottom were like presumably swarthy Italians. The guy looked like Stalin, just in like a crushed velvet shirt, just like lazing beside the pool.
I remember this. Yeah, I think it was Elsevier magazine.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And the thing we kind of like joked about was like, okay, there's this woman in like office attire, and she's obviously running to her job, but there's also this factory worker, and we're just like, there are no Dutch factory workers. Stop fucking lying. This is a heavily financialized economy.
20 marketing executives fine-tuned the guy who looks like Stalin to make sure to trigger like Dutch boomers to like pick up the magazine.
But yeah, it is a little bit telling on yourself, and again, it's this moralizing thing of just like separating it out as well, because I've lived in Northern Europe all my life, and I know the second the fucking sun comes out, everything stops. Like, you can't, like, we all just like take a break. We go to the canal, we go to the seaside, like. But then if you try to position this as like, no, that's what the immoral bad citizens do, then like, why won't I vote for the guy with the goofy hair who says he's going to, like, I don't know, genocide Indonesians or something? I mean, what are you offering me?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of like, I mean, if you're keen, of course, but this would be pivoting into one of the things that we haven't really talked about, and that is the complicity of a lot of Dutch media. And I say media in a general sense, but really what I'm talking about is television and radio. Dutch print media tends to be a little better, save for that Elsevier magazine with which ran the cover. But one of the most important things to understand about Dutch media is that it's incredibly stupid.
Yes, go on.
that it really has incredibly limited self-awareness in the way that it perpetuates and amplifies and reinforces certain stereotypes in the way that it treats politicians uncritically, and in the way that it's really remarkably willing, and there's actual data on this, to invite far-right politicians into their studios, into their talk show tables, into their evening program, to give them softball questions and let them talk about how the most recent revelations about anti-Semitism in their party are really, really overblown. And so, this is, and if you criticize them on this, they get incredibly testy. They get incredibly sort of aggrieved, right? Because they're like, "Oh, are you accusing me of being a bad journalist? Do you hate journalism? Do you hate journalists in general? Do you hate freedom of speech? What blah 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 blah." But the numbers quite clearly show that especially Dutch talk shows, in numbers that do not really match their actual political power, invite far right figures over to the talk shows to have very, very friendly sit downs with them. And even if they have quote unquote left wing people on, it's usually one of those left wing people that a genuine left wing person does not really recognize as a member of the same political team, right? It's usually some kind of well-meaning centrist, if that, who is ineffective and kind of babbles and stammers, and just gives the left overall a bad name. So no one's on the left in the Netherlands is happy with Dutch TV media, Dutch radio. Again, and I say this as someone who has some friends also in Dutch print media. I think print media tends to be better. But Dutch journalism in generally doesn't really have a conception of politics. And I think this goes to the heart of the matter. And this is a more serious point, now that I've sort of gotten this off my chest. I think the more serious point is that many Dutch journalists understand politics as sort of this intricate game, right, between political parties, who's up and who's down, who's talking to who seems to be criticized, who seems to capture the zeitgeist, who is popular, who had the good one-liner, that kind of stuff, right? Scandal, slip-ups, intra-party politics. It's all wonderfully entertaining, but they don't understand ideology. They don't understand a more thorough analysis of Dutch social life, of Dutch economics, of ideas, and it just hurts discourse because everything gets dragged down to popularity contests.
Well, that has to happen because due to the crusade against the nudity on TV, politics had to become Game of Thrones because Game of Thrones on Dutch TV was 30 minutes long in total, with all the dick removed. But it strikes me as as someone who doesn't understand Dutch, bar the I have a little bit of German, therefore I can pick out the odd proper noun. I have seen a lot of Dutch TV, and it does seem kind of fairly sensational. And there is also a relatively decent comparison to be made with the UK, when you talked about how they react to you have a right-wing bias kind of thing, or you might have a racial bias to these supposedly impartial journalists. A very notable thing that happens in the UK is that you get a whole media class of people who consider it worse to be called racist than actual racism itself.
Yeah, it's very, very similar. Yeah. That's very similar. And I think to add to what Thijs has been saying is that so what these TV stations say is, but these people need to be on our shows because they're very popular, so they deserve to be. And they kind of end up in this cycle, right? Because the more they air them, the more people see them, the more people vote for them as well. There's a lot of research done to that, especially after the Trump elections, of the relationship between how much airtime we give someone and how people just think of that person more. Yeah. And they don't see that because they see that upsetness on the right as valid, these people are upset, we should look at them. And if you would then say listen, you have a tendency to be very obsessed with upset white men, they would be that's not at all the point. We don't do identity politics in the Netherlands. That's American stuff. And more than just being American stuff, identity politics is stuff about women and race. How are these people involved in that? They're just white men. They don't have a race or a gender. And at the same time, when they do have, for example, Savannah Simons on, the leader of Bijeen, or most leftist party today, a black woman, they do treat her terribly, and they give her an incredible hard time, and it's completely not related to the amount of seats that she has in parliament, which is 1, 2 for comparison. Thierry Baudet or Geert Wilders, who are way bigger but get almost an easier time, and they treat her, and I think women in general in politics, way more terrible without noticing, because identity politics are not a thing in the Netherlands.
But like this is very it's like oddly transparent, because you can make this comparison to Volt and Bijeen, as like Bijeen is like, this is both their first election that just happened, but like Volt had the backing of a bunch of like the bad guy from Beauty and the Beast and like Lubach, who I mentioned earlier. So like they got all this media attention, whereas I don't know anyone with any sense, like as far as I can understand, the like one seat that Bijeen like worked like tooth and nail to get was against media, was like purely because they had like this groundswell of activist support.
That's right, yeah.
And then it also seems like the Dutch media basically created whole cloth. I'm going to try to pronounce it the Dutch way, cherry baguette. But like the Thierry Baudet, as I've been calling him. But like he's like, whatever you want to say about Geert Wilders seems to have like had some sort of base of support before the media latched onto him. But like Thierry Baudet seems like 100% media creation.
He very much is, and of course he used to work in media. He used to be a print columnist, regularly seen pundit on talk shows, etc. Before he sort of switched over to first having a think tank that he then transformed into a political party. I think this is hard to fathom maybe for people who don't live in the Netherlands, but one of the most well-known Dutch media presenters, Jort Kelder, who like gets to play a journalist on TV, right? He gets to host a talk show. He gets to interview people, is also Mark Rutte's best friend. And apparently this is not a problem at all for those TV programs, right? They don't seem to think of this as a bad thing, that you can have someone's best friend. And mind you, Jort Kelder secured, what a talent, a exclusive one-on-one interview with Mark Rutte just before the election, where he could talk just with Prime Minister Mark Rutte about, how he experienced being a prime minister as a person. And it's mind-boggling that this doesn't get more. I mean, there's people yelling about it on Twitter all the time, and I'm one of them. But it doesn't generally get more scrutiny because it's a very insular world, right? The world of Dutch politics, Dutch media, and punditry is a single universe that just overlaps, and where people move freely from one position to another, right? You can have been a government minister the one day and be a successful columnist for a national newspaper the other day, and vice versa. It's just this incredible small world of people who all know each other and like to pat each other on the back after a long day of doing discourse. And that's the whole thing. I think the most incredible moment of this whole election campaign came when 2 Dutch journalists of the National Broadcasting Agency, the NOS, on election night, after having weeks on end of being the arbiters of who got to be on TV, said to each other, let's talk about which parties managed to get in the news cycle, as if this was something they didn't. I'm not even joking, as if this was not something that they were, personally involved in. It's insane.
Let's talk about who managed to get into the news cycle. As you can see, I'm sharing on my screen my contacts list. These people.
Yeah.
I like to imagine that this is exactly when Fukuyama said the Dutch reached the end of history first, that this is what he was talking about. He was just like strolling through a TV studio being like, hey, this is what I've been talking about. It actually kind of fits a bit. If anyone's read the actual essay, The End of History, the very last paragraph is like whiplash, because he says, and I quote, I mean, this is less about media, but I think it gets to like what culture is at the end of history. Anyway, Fukuyama says, after 18 pages of like, or I guess 17, of, talking about how, liberalism and um, liberal democracy, whatever the term is they use, is the final, is the steady state of human existence. He says, quote, "The end of history will be a very sad time. In the post-historical period, there will be neither art nor philosophy, just the perpetual caretaking of the museum of human history." And he later refers to these, quote, "centuries of boredom." And like, this is what he had in mind. Like, this is like exactly how that appears, like, not from the political lens, but if you just like turn and look at it the other way, this, like, the media landscape, the cultural landscape, it's running on its own fumes.
But to a certain extent, like that is kind of true, especially of like, I don't know, like I constantly think of the like Miliband, Clegg, Tony Cameron kind of debates of like 2010s of just like, yeah, we got like 3 stock photos of like young office men. I typed in brackets tanned for Miliband, I guess, but like we're putting them together on stage, and of course, if someone comes along to that kind of political landscape and says, I'm going to do a Geert Wilders quote here, calling for a liberal jihad against Islam, like, of course, the entire section of the population is going to like perk up and be like, oh, that's new, that's exciting, because everything else has just been so dull, so boring.
This reminds me of another article that Auden Amschen wrote in Jacobin that you mentioned too, or you mentioned his book, Thijs. But this debate or talk that was hosted between Fukuyama and this Dutch politician Bolkestein. Can you introduce who he is and what this debate was?
Yeah. So Bolkestein, Frits Bolkestein is one of the most prominent senior politicians of the VVD, Mark Rutte's party. He's sort of he's living a quiet life now away from the public eye because he's very, very old. But in the 1990s, he pretty much began pioneering this anti-immigrant sentiment on the right, and he began writing about questions of why has the Netherlands not experienced, like the Anglo-Saxon world has, a more profound and deep conservative backlash against the political cultures of the 1960s and 70s, right? Or against the new left. And he begins to first question this and then advancing it, of course, in an ideological sense. And so for Marijn Oudenamsen, who did his PhD on this figure as well, the revolt against the Dutch establishment, right, that is exemplified by Pim Fortuyn and later by Geert Wilders, begins by Frits Bolkestein. And Geert Wilders, of course, was working for Bolkestein when he was still an active politician, right? So Geert Wilders is really a product of Bolkestein.
Also very funny to me that Bolkestein, before he was a politician, he worked 16 years for Royal Dutch Shell. Talk about establishment.
Talk about establishment, exactly.
Corporate directors, which,
for fuck's sake.
But yeah, he sort of stands at this beginning of like the conservative or even neoconservative, if you want to call it that, turn in Dutch politics. And we talked about the British connection earlier. I do want to notice that there's a very, very strong American connection to this Dutch politics as well. And it's not just through Bolkestein. It's also back then you had, the Germans call this a Stiftung, but a Stichting, the Edmund Burke Society in the Netherlands.
Sounds cool already.
Which had frequent study trips to Washington, D.C., where they would talk to prominent neoliberal or neocons and sort of like import that to the Netherlands. I think one of the most lasting contributions this society has made is popularizing Tocqueville in the Netherlands as this, paragon of a different kind of social criticism, one that is conservative. And don't discount, for example, that Martin Bosma, who is Geert Wilders' second man and has been for his entire career, chief ideologue of the PVV party, studied in the United States for a little while, and there, by his own account, actually read voraciously the books of Norman Podhoretz, right, making it, and those kinds of screeds. There is yes, a strong British-Dutch connection, especially on what happens in the transfer on the left with the PvdA and Blue Labour. But on the right, there is also a very, very strong American connection. I mean, Geert Wilders is still funded by a lot of deep pockets from the United States as well.
Well, yeah, I think a central thesis of our show is that like there is an American connection to pretty much every European modern country. So that reminds everyone, please check out our website, operationglad.io. But moving swiftly on, the
well, if I don't know what you want to switch to, Kieran, but the reason I brought up Bolkestein is that in his writings, at least Odin Amshin gets into this. Like, he basically criticized Fukuyama for saying, no, actually there is a meaning in politics today, and it's, this great struggle against Islam. And whether it's, the liberal jihad, or you have this quote here, a cold war against Islam, like whatever you frame it in. And this is the neoconservative connection, because they were, the preeminent cold warriors, and they need to like create a political struggle. If you're trying to fend off like, class politics.
I mean, yeah, but it's also like sometimes every time I hear like a certain generation of people bring up like it's a new Cold War against something else, it's always just like, all right, you're having a midlife crisis. We all go through this. You just want to relive the glory days of when you fought someone with a backwards alphabet. Like it's like a Cold War against the Muslim world. They don't have nukes. Like, what are you talking about? Like, oh, sorry. I love these normal quotes. Great country, wonderful country. It's all a collection of wonderful countries.
I mean, to Geert Wilders' credit, I mean, he didn't say Cold War, but he just said a jihad.
Yes, yeah, no, he was more reframed than this. I think the Cold War against Islam quote is from Pim Fortuyn. Yeah. But Jesus. Anyway,
but again, I think that like most Dutch people would defend this as normal speech. Like they would say like, this is free speech and you should be allowed to say it. So like it's these two figures and they do get a lot of votes, but even the people who do not vote for them or who will say like, I disagree, still live in that same landscape of media and discussion of like free speech is super valuable and important and everything and everyone should be heard and platformed. So I think that's, in itself, what keeps getting us into trouble, I think, is that idea of like all opinions are valid.
Yeah, I like, it's weird. It's kind of like a hard defense to argue because of if someone says like, oh, it's free speech, he should be allowed to say this. I'm like, yes, he should. This is fucking hilarious. Where's this Twitter account I can follow? You're telling me he's in the parliament? Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the issue, right? And we have a lot of strange parties in parliament.
I have an entire Twitter list of like tradcath like accounts from various European countries just saying the most insane shit. And it's funny because they don't have any power. They barely have like 500 followers. So that's why it's funny. But like when it's like, head of sometimes possibly the largest or second largest party in a fairly population, fairly rich European country, then no, this isn't fun.
And especially if people then, like don't even really like, it's not that they just say he should be allowed to say it, but also say something. They will add something like, I understand where he's coming from though, or, or like, I do understand the feelings. Like, I might not agree with this statement in this percent. They will always like try to negotiate ways to, because in their mind, if you stop that negotiation, like things will get worse and spin out of control. And yeah, we've just been like a frog in boiling water, right? Like slowly the water gets hotter and we keep saying like, no, this is also normal and this is also okay. And we just need to keep talking with each other and have fascists on our TV shows. And that will fix itself.
I see where he's coming from. I want a second Vietnam War where we lose and Vietnam becomes Muslim.
I see where he's coming from. My friend who I know also really hates. Yeah.
It's the like late 90s Eminem strategy of I'm just joking about what you and your friends joke about in your bedroom. It's like, are you really? Okay.
Are you really?
So the last little point I want to talk about is, I guess, snaps us to the present a little bit. Is one of the reasons why the left had a hard time this election is austerity and the return of the state. Like, austerity is kind of dead to the right wing parties. There is this now, mostly due to the pandemic. There's this consensus amongst I want to say Rutte's party and D66 that like, maybe we should do a bit of like public investment and should do some like expanding social security. I just want to make sure that, like, I've seen this in other countries as well, but is that like broadly correct of like how some of these parties have been reacting?
I have some questions about that. I mean, looking at our recent election cycle and the way that was discussed by many people, there are some ideas about more public investments in some ways, that then also kind of, like specifically with the VVD, with Mark Rutte's party, it's presented as his party moving to the left to voters. Like, see, he also wants healthcare now that we're all dying. Probably means he's a leftist too. And, like at the same time, all the leftist parties that had visionary ideas and did really want to change things were kind of shut down by both right-wing parties as well as the media in general, who were all constantly in the media speaking about how that would basically give future generations endless bills that would never be paid off and would put them in debt forever. And, that like if we would really change the system that much and be a functioning welfare state again, that would basically bankrupt us and cause all these issues, rhetorics that are simply not true and still very, very invested in austerity. Mm-hmm. So,
I agree with Annelot here. And, I'll see it, I'll believe it when I see it, about this supposed left-wing turn of right-wing parties. But I do think that one immediate effect of it has been, and this is kind of story of the Dutch left in the past few years or even decades, is that by this new narrative of, everyone's for a strong government now, right? We've all come around to this point. Even the governing VVD party is, suddenly we understand the need for a strong government that takes care of certain basic things. Is that the uniqueness of the left-wing story about we want government for the people and not just for the multinationals, even though, brave attempts at driving this point home were made, kind of got washed out. And in part, I think the reason because it got washed out is because there's this attitude, and we talked about it a little bit before on the Dutch left, is that the best that you can aspire to is entering into a governing coalition. And this recent election, it really, really looked like, and it happened to be true, that Mark Rutte was going to be coasting to re-election quite easily. Nothing could really dent him for some reason. He was polling well. He was consistently polling well, and he was going to go into the election as the surefire winner. And so the Green Party, I think particularly, sort of tried to position itself as, we're reasonable folk, right? We don't do opposition too hard or too harshly. And so they didn't politicize the handling, the very, very bad and inept handling of the COVID crisis by the Dutch government. They didn't really politicize this out of a sense that we're all in this together. It just needs to be solved. And we are here as dependable, reliable, left-wing future coalition partners that can help solve this crisis for us. But if you refuse to do genuine opposition, people are just going to be like, well, then what's the difference, right? And again, like you said before, Kieran, if it's Diet Coke or Coke, I'll just have a Coke. Let me be indulgent.
Yeah. That's fair. Okay. So I think that's rounding out. Well, there's some more stuff to say, but like we're trying to fit an analysis of I think like Europe's 6th or 8th most populated country into like an hour and a half. But I'm glad we managed to do it. That's everything you need to know about the Netherlands. Nothing more, nothing less.
That's right. Yeah. I would ask one question. I don't know if you want to, Kieran. This is like, again, would take another hours to answer, but I always feel like I need to ask after talking about how the like whether you want to call it fake politics, a spectacle, depoliticization, how it took root in a particular country. What do you see as the most, whether or not it's like big or very small, like what do you see as like potential for like to politicize people, to give people like a forward political direction, to bring people together? Are there any issues or groups or, I don't know, ongoing events that you want to make note of?
Well, we have Bijeen in our parliament now with Sylvana Simons, and that is a major thing. She also ran in 2017 and didn't make it then, and she did make it now. And yesterday, when we had these very long debates because Rutte lied about stuff, which Parliament ultimately didn't approve, but also didn't fire him for. But anyhow, we had these big debates where all these newly elected politicians could really show themselves and shine. And she was there and did very great. And, a lot of people in my surroundings who didn't vote for her during the elections were like texting me saying like, oh, I wish the elections were right now because I would vote for her next time. Or even people who really didn't vote for her who would say, I'm really happy she's there and she's doing really great. I thought that kind of showed a normalization of radical leftist idealism that, that still has a home somewhere. And that, I'm really happy that she's there. And I keep trying to urge people to become members of the party as well and support them in any possible way because, they're truly opposing both Rutte and the extreme right and urging for, a better future, a more radical leftist future.
I'm slightly less optimistic. There was a statistic that the PvdA's base, like political base, is very, very old and is all going to die pretty much in the next 10 to 20 years tops. And I think that left-wing political power draws on other sites of mobilization, right? And this happens in society first. And it traditionally, of course, was labor unions, those types of organizations. In the Netherlands, labor unions, by and large, are still dominated by baby boomers and sub-boomers, but like older folks that are in there to protect their benefits and pensions. And I think a genuine resurgence of left-wing politics in the Netherlands that is greater than just some, nice parties that we like to have in the margins needs to come from a repolitization of Dutch social life, which I don't really see happening in the short term, although there are some specks of light. So I'm a little less optimistic. And if you look at the voting preferences of young people, you can see that for the foreseeable future, the left is going to remain decimated. So build it outside of politics first before you're going to see a resurgence of left-wing power in parliament as well. And that will have to, be a long and arduous work, rebuilding the labor unions, making sure that they speak to young people instead of just old people. But we'll see.
I think this is where Thijs and I always end in every podcast, is that I say something very positive and then Thijs says something very negative, and then I'm like, yeah, Thijs, you're also right. And then we're like, well, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, and, keep going forward. He's obviously right. Like, it's terrible. But yeah.
Sadder for it, but yeah. It was great, guys. I really enjoyed being here, and thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Where can people listening find you? And if it's incredibly Dutch, don't worry, we will put a link to it in the description for people.
Well, we're on Twitter under @Redelijke Midden, also on Instagram under the same tag. And you can listen to us.
Yeah, to be clear, that is the podcast that I think no one ever mentioned because Kieran was too scared to
That's
try.
right.
Yeah.
We have very occasional English language episodes, but they're specials, and generally we tend to be in Dutch. So unless you don't,
I listen to it.
you speak the dark language. I'm very proud of you. But yeah.
Cool. We'll also have links to Thijs and Annelot's personal Twitters in the description. for you
We're
guys.
very funny.
They are. I have checked it out, and I hit that Google Translate button. And I'm like, oh yeah,
Pretty funny, huh?
This is a good tweet. It's something I like.
Difficult when it's an image macro. Really,
yeah. God, I need Google Translate to get on that like right
the
now.
international Twitter community. We need to have a conference to sort out how to work with jokes that are in the meme format. Yeah,
exactly. Like, but look, the impact font memes just made it to mainland Europe. Okay, this is not too late to solve this. Yeah, but in general, that's the Netherlands. I hope everyone listening learned a lot. It's good to see real politics enter the parliament again in the form of Volt. Definitely not like a party of spectacle and kids who have landlords for parents. But we will. We wish everyone well in the Cold War against Islam. This podcast is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of the Netherlands. And yep, signing out. We'll see you on the bonus feed. Ciao, ciao.
Peace.
Bye.
Bye.